Welcome. This is Dr. Owen Anderson, and we're continuing in Augustine's Confessions. And we left off last time. Augustine had gone to Milan, and there he heard Ambrose. And Ambrose answered some common, really not too difficult objections to the Bible. In Milan, hearing Ambrose and having some of his objections to the Bible answered. And this raises a problem in this sense. Here's a problem with young Augustine's view of himself. He thought of himself as a very thoughtful guy. But he mocked those who believed in the Bible on the basis of his own simple misunderstandings. So that isn't very thoughtful at all. If he was so thoughtful, why didn't he take the time to look into this himself? And the special one that he has a trouble with is this. Literalist readings that he thought ended up in contradictions, especially about God having a body. So he's really wrestling with that problem about all he can think about is corporeal. He, in his Manichaeanism, he's a Gnostic of the Manichaean sort, which thinks there's two kinds of stuff. Light stuff, which is good, and dark stuff, which is bad. And the light stuff, your soul, is stuck into the body. And everything is one of those two things, material. And so he's having this problem as he comes to realize not all things are material. Manichaeism is losing its hold on him, it's weakening. So his mother, Monica, joins him in Milan and learns her prayers have been answered, at least in respect to Manichaeanism. And he gives something of her personality here. Having traveled from Africa to Italy, there was a storm, and she's the one comforting the sailors and travelers on the boat. Normally, you'd look to the crew to do that for you. So he's trying to help us see her caring nature extends not just to her own kid, but to everyone around her. So he says, I was rescued from falsehood, revived. And what else could you want for your soul than to be rescued from falsehood? This is where we begin to see the analogous use of the term light and dark. He was using it in a physical sense, but we use it in terms of truth and ignorance. Your soul is in the darkness of ignorance, or your soul has the light of understanding. Now, he's not yet a Christian. And he speaks about Catholic Christian just because there are then, just as there are now, various groups that go by the name Christian. So what that alerts you to is just that this is, I'll call it standard or Orthodox Christianity, not one of the other views that might say something like Jesus is an angel or there is no Trinity, things like that. So he's also speaking about Ambrose and the benefits Ambrose was giving, a fountain of mercies. God's a fountain of mercies. And Ambrose is answering his mother's prayers by having somebody who's like Augustine, smart. Have you heard the phrase, too smart for your own good, too clever for your own good? So Augustine's coming to realize that about himself. He's too clever for his own good. He thought he was quite clever, but the things that he mocked were easily resolved if he thought about it. Now, he goes into, in part 2 here, a practice his mom had of going about says, when then my mother had once, as she was wont to do in Africa, brought to the churches built in the memory of the saints certain cakes and bread and wine. She has this practice of going to the churches. It's almost as if she's giving a kind of sacrament, bringing bread and wine. And he talks here about her that she is herself not much of a drinker of alcohol. This is watered down wine. But she'll go and she'll have some with the believers there. And Ambrose points out to her why this is not a good practice. It could encourage poor habits. And she immediately stops doing it. So soon then, as she found this custom to be forbidden by that famous preacher and most pious prelate, even to those that would use it soberly, lest so an occasion of excess might be given to the drunken, and for that these, as it were, anniversary funeral solemnities did much resemble the superstitions of the Gentiles, she most willingly forbore it. So it could encourage some persons to be drunken, even though she isn't. And it resembles the superstitions of the Gentiles, which you don't want to continue to encourage. The Gentiles have various magical rituals, superstitions that are offered up to demons, and you don't want to bring them with you. So just a couple pictures about Monica and her care for Augustine, her care for others, but also her willingness to be teachable. Which you might think, wow, people who are teachers must be around others who are teachable all the time. But that's actually a very rare trait. To be teachable doesn't mean that someone will cram for a test to get a good grade, so they get a degree to get a good job. To be teachable means they actually come to comprehend the material. And the temptation for students, of course, is the first one. Well, I know there's going to be a test. I kind of know what the questions are like. I'll study for those, get a good grade, get a good job, have an easy life. That's not the same as being teachable. Now, he has another interesting story about a beggar. He and his friends see a beggar. And this person is happy. He's given a few pennies, uses them to buy a little wine, and is happy with his life. Whereas Augustine is anxious and miserable. So he says to his friends, maybe we should be like this beggar. I mean, my life is filled with anxiety as I'm stressed out about tests, about he has to give a speech where he's going to praise the emperor, and he's worried about that. This is all it takes to have a happy life. Why not do that? Why are you living the rat race, they call it? Have you heard that? And you're running after all these other things. When happiness is so easy to get that this uneducated guy can stand on the corner, someone throws him a little bit of money, and he's happy. What a simple solution to the suffering of life. Have you ever thought about doing that? Setting aside all those anxieties that you allow society to lump on your shoulders. Well, what it does for Augustine, it's not simply that he's not like oh, here's a practical solution to my problems. What it does for him is it raises a problem about his understanding of happiness. He wants awards, praise, vainglory. He thinks those things are what gets you happiness. But here is this beggar who doesn't have those things and saved himself a lot of effort trying to get them and is happy. So it's a kind of like an argument. It's like a counter to his belief about happiness. And I don't know, I don't want these words to make us think Augustine's different. This is pretty common for students. They want to be told that they're an honors student, that they're the smartest student. To be get an award, minimally, you want to get the award of a degree and go on and get a good job. And it feels good if you have your professors praise you for being so smart. And that's all called vainglory. It's worthless. Most of the time, the professors are lying. And the other times, they may not be a very good judge of that anyway. And the awards pass away, praises come to naught. It's vanity. So he's putting his happiness on vanity. But it's what he's been told in his culture, and it's very similar to the messages we get about what it means to be successful. Not successful means you know the truth. Successful means you've gotten these kinds of accolades. When do you know you've made it? When you get an Oscar. Then you know you've made it. Some award, right? Whatever the equivalent is in your sphere of life. So that's a side note he mentions with his friend there. Now, with the beggar, he's talking to his friends. But it's disturbing up to him that it's going to keep reflecting on it. So he says, I, however, certainly had no opportunity of inquiring what I wished of that so holy oracle of thine. He's speaking about Ambrose here, part 4. But those tides of me to be poured out to him required his full leisure time and never found it. So he speaks a little bit about how Ambrose is quite busy. But even so, he's more and more convinced that all the knots of those crafty calumnies, that the supposed contradictions that were there in Scripture that he used to make fun of, he's more and more convinced that those can be unraveled and not too difficult to do so. What he thought were certain ridiculous things to point out to the Christian turn out to be easily responded to. He just hadn't ever taken the time to reflect on a good response. But he keeps coming back to this problem that God is bound by human shape. Not God incarnate. That's the human nature of Christ that has a shape. But that's God incarnate. God pre-existed the incarnation. The God who created the material world is not bound by a human shape. And for him, that resolves many of the problems that he thought he had. The simple truth that God's a spirit, not a material object. And you still find people today, I often encounter people who think they can prove there is no God because they've looked around and don't see anybody. That's the same error, right? How do you prove God exists? Well, he usually passes by about 10:30. I'll point him out. He has to drop off books in the library around 10:30. Well, that would be a physical form of some kind, not God. So he says that God's a spirit, doesn't have limbs, but God is everywhere and also nowhere. This is a coupling to make us think. He's not just simply contradicting himself. How can God be everywhere and also nowhere? Well, in different senses, different respects. God is everywhere in the same way that we are anywhere. Have you ever said to someone, you don't seem to be here? Yeah. So the physical presence of your body doesn't guarantee you're here. What makes you here is your consciousness, right? So that comes out in a conversation. The person's attentive, alert. If they're just kind of zoning out, say, you're not even listening. You're not here. So God is everywhere in the sense of being conscious of all things. He's not like over there, but not in here, in the sense that I'm not over there because I'm not aware of what's going on over there. God's aware of all things. But not because he's physically present, because he's consciously present. That's why he can say he's everywhere, but he's nowhere in space. Like if I catch a little bit, ooh, I got a little bit of God. See it? Quick, it's really restless. It gets out fast. Oh, it got away. If you didn't see it, it's gone. Or they look for the God particle. It's really hard to isolate a God particle. Right? Like, there it is. I got God for a second. Oh, it's gone now. Well, that's not a spirit who's conscious, right? That's a particle. Misnomer. So this then takes him to this question. In what sense are humans the image of God? He'd always taken this in some physical sense. God, like us, has limbs and eyes and ears. Someone sees me and they say, you know, you look just like God. You have God's nose. I always thought that. Well, that's not the sense in which humans are the image of God. And this harkens us back now to the beginning of the book 6 to answer the question. He says, at the beginning of book 6, that God had separated him from the beasts, made him wiser, yet he was in darkness. In what sense is he separated from the beasts? Well, now return to part 5. What is this image? And he's thinking that this is like a physical image. God has arms and legs, not just for legs, like dogs. So dogs aren't the image of God because they don't have arms. No. It's in what he said here: wise, wisdom, knowledge, understanding. There's a difference in kind, not degree, between the humans and the animals. Any human, no matter what their language is, you can learn their language and communicate with them, right? Because they have thoughts, they have propositions that they believe are true, and they give arguments for those. You can debate with them about that. That's what humans do. And whatever else the beasts figure out, they don't do that. They could fly from Canada to Mexico and back every single year. Quite amazing. I can't do that without it. I need my phone. Before there were iPhones, the geese were doing this. They could smell water a mile away and go find it. Tiny bit of water in the desert. But they won't be able to write a book about how they did it either. No opposable thumbs, Anderson. We can hold it in your mouth and write. So the image of God. connecting up with what God is. As he sees, the essence of God is not that God's a body. God is conscious. God has wisdom. And just like God has wisdom, humans can have wisdom. But that also means that humans have a deeper misery than the animals can have. Animals can only have physical misery. They can suffer physically. Humans can do that too. But the animals can't have that darkness of soul that comes from emptiness, meaninglessness, where they realize the futility of their own existence. And they're cut off from all things important. So then again, in part 6, he comes back to the scriptures. For the first time, he begins to understand the Old Testament. Before, he used to like to point out absurdity, what he thought were absurdities in it. Now he sees he was mistaken to think they were. And it's not just that, it's that they're pretty easily answered. They're not even difficult things. So he says it was as if there was a veil over him that the Holy Spirit removed, so he can now understand some very plain and simple things. And he continues to want certainty. But he also comes to see there are some things to believe without demonstration. And how many such things he believed all his life. Gives an example. How you take it on authority that the history you are taught of yourself, who your parents are, your city, your country is true. I mean, you might say there's like a couple things here or there that are mistaken. You might say that there's that the right facts weren't emphasized. Other things should have been emphasized, but you don't doubt that there was a World War II from this date to that date. You don't doubt who your parents were, and you don't really have any proof for it. Like if I was to say to you, prove to me right now that the two people you think are your parents are your parents, you wouldn't have any proof. You'd maybe at best go home and bring back a birth certificate. I say, of course, fake parents would make a fake birth certificate to trick you. So you go and get pictures. Here's a baby in my mom's hands. That's not you. Obviously, a different nose. You can tell, different nose. But they have that same kind of thing. And I don't think anyone from my doubting those things is now actually troubled. Like, oh my goodness, I don't know my parents. That's just silly. But they have that same kind of thing given to them in the scriptures. And they do mock it and doubt it. There you're told by authority things about yourself and the world. And people say, yeah, but I don't believe that. But you do believe your birth certificate. Oh, yeah, for sure. That'd be interesting to think about. Which would be easier to counterfeit? I think at first you might think Bible. But here's a problem. As soon as I introduce a change to the Bible, I have to hunt down every version that's already out there and reclaim them and exchange them for my new one. It'd be very difficult. And at this time, it'd be impossible. Now it'd be pretty well impossible. In that world, it'd be impossible. You have hundreds of thousands of the same manuscript across the known world. To then say, but I want to introduce a change to support my own power. I'll change a couple passages to support my power. Well, all those other manuscripts already exist. I couldn't get rid of them. Not to mention that I'm talking about the Christian scriptures. Then you have the Old Testament guarded by the Jews, who are particularly good at making sure no changes are introduced to it. So these are some of the simple things to respond to about objections. However, this doesn't show that it is true. It shows those simple objections, you should have done better than that. And that shows something about Augustine, that he's not as clever as he thinks he is. And for anyone now relying on those kind of objections, they're not as clever as they think they are. But he says something here in part 7. Believe in things that are not demonstrated, and then the many things that he believed without proof. That the how many things he believed without proof, and how the philosophers who told him to reject the scriptures themselves are in contradictions. So the very philosophers who say you should reject the Bible because it's full of contradictions are themselves contradicting themselves. They're not a reliable guide. But then he still wants to know this question. Part 7, how knowest thou those scriptures do have been imparted unto mankind by the Spirit of the one true and most true God? For this is the very thing of all to be believed. You'd have to know there is a God who gives scriptures in the first place. If there is no God, then the scriptures aren't from God because there's no God. We're saying there's no unicorns and the unicorns wrote a book. Well, no, they didn't because there aren't any unicorns. But then point 8, he says something. Since then, we are too weak by abstract reasonings to find out truth, and for this very cause needed the authority of Holy Writ, I have now begun to believe that thou wouldst never have given such excellency of authority to that writ in all thy lands, hast thou not willed thereby to be believed in. So let's phrase this. How do we know the scriptures are from God? We'd have to know there's a God in the first place. But then when he says in part 8 there, that abstract reasonings are too weak to arrive at the truth. And so we need to be told the truth in book form. I think this is going to come back to haunt him. And I'm not even sure the extent to which he believes this himself, because as we're going to see in the next part, he goes on to use reason to give proofs for God's existence. But this turns the Bible into a source of information instead of redemptive revelation. What's the difference? Because isn't that information? Well, redemptive revelation means we have sinned, are guilty of something, and need to be forgiven and redeemed. So that means that the thing we are guilty of can't be not listening to redemptive revelation. That'd be circular. Why do I need the Bible? Because you didn't listen to the Bible. You need the Bible because you had a revelation of God. Called general revelation in creation all around you that you ignored. So that's a little different. That's not saying you need the Bible because of the weakness of reason. It's saying you need it precisely because you could have used reason and didn't. And you need to repent of that. You need to be forgiven. So this introduces something that might come back as a problem for him. Fideism. It'll come back to cause problems for him and others. So it's interesting to see someone who otherwise you might say, wow, it's really making some good progress here. But on this point, not quite get it right. And we've seen that since that time, there's been a lot of struggles on this exact same point. Still a lot of fideism.